Hello, welcome to Talking Europe on France 24. I'm Catherine Nicholson. Our topic today is one that many people might have assumed was no big issue here in Europe, the continent that prides itself on democratic freedoms. We're talking about freedom of the press, of the media, and it's not just about claims of fake news and trust in reporting. The recent murder of a Maltese investigative journalist, Daphne Caruana Galizia, has left many people questioning whether reporters really are free to hold the powerful to account. Well, we'll talk about her case in a bit more detail later. Joining our debate today are three members of the European Parliament. From the UK, I'm pleased to welcome Claude Moraes of the European Socialists and Democrats Group. Thanks for being with us. And from the Netherlands, MEP Sophia in 't Veld, who's with the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats. Thank you for your time. And we're also joined from Malta by Francis Zamit-Dimech. You're with the European People's Party. Thank you all for being with us today here on France 24. Now, I think it's probably best if we start with a report from Malta, where we can tell you more about Daphne Caruana Galizia's story. France 24's reporters Anais Al-Hamedawi and Jean Guerard have been to the island for us.
The blogger had no government protection. Working alone was a network of anonymous sources. 2 weeks after the blast, her murder was still the top headline in the Times of Malta.
All the journalists' families were concerned at what happened. Yes, I mean it's worrying.
6 car bombs in 18 months, none of which have been resolved. And this is in a small country like this, which is actually meant to be one of the safest in Europe. So there is clearly here a problem of people acting with impunity. And this is what worries me and what worries my colleagues, that the institutions have been allowed to operate in such a way that the police, there is not much trust in them.
450,000 residents, a burgeoning economy, tourism on the rise. But the Mediterranean island is also proving a haven for mafia activity. Its political opposition accuses the government of allowing corruption and criminality to flourish unchecked.
God forbid the Prime Minister did it himself or commissioned it himself. God forbid. But he is certainly politically responsible. It comes after a series of events that took place, such as the dismantling of public institutions that are no longer effective, from the police commissioner to the attorney general in this country, such as one corruption scandal after another, culminating in Panama Papers that involved people in the highest positions of power.
Such accusations have made it all the way to the European Parliament. Malta's government is under pressure.
I completely refute any outrageous claims such as this country does not uphold rule of law. People in general and journalists do feel safe to work in Malta.
That's an opinion that's not shared by these women who've come to protest outside the Prime Minister's office. On their T-shirts, words from Daphne's final blog post, published just a half hour before her death. They won the resignations of both the general prosecutor and the chief of police.
So there we are, that report from Anais Al-Hamedawi and Jean Guerard. Francis Zamit-Dimech, we'll come to you first. We're talking about your country, of course. 8 major media organisations have written to the European Commission about this case. They say that Daphne Caruana Galizia was silenced. She was murdered to silence her investigation into high-level corruption. Can we expect there to be a full, fair, independent investigation? Because there do seem to be question marks for many people about that.
Well, that is certainly what all the people of Malta would expect to have. But I would regret to have to state that the investigations as being conducted do not inspire the required level of trust. In fact, if one looks precisely at what even the civil society network in Malta is demanding, they are demanding the immediate resignation and change of the police commissioner and also of the attorney general. And why are they doing that? Because we have had as many as 5 police commissioners in the space of 4 years. The present police commissioner was appointed after that his predecessor had received a report which precisely points out to corruption and money laundering at the highest levels possible of government. This is precisely what Daphne Caruana Galizia was working on. She was the first journalist in Malta to reveal Panama Papers. She was the person to indicate the links between those papers and the highest levels of government. She was carrying out her job relentlessly with great courage. Her life was in danger. The government of Malta knew that. Why was she not afforded protection by government, by the police? Why is the police commissioner now ultimately responsible for the investigation? The same person who simply ignored the report, even from Malta's own Financial Intelligence Analysis Unit, that pinpoints the corruption and the money laundering that she was exposing. In other words, there is a collapse of the institutions, a collapse of rule of law. And this is why the people of Malta would like to see the European Commission to be more proactive, to be more attentive to what is being happening.
Well, Sophia in 't Veld, you spoke recently in the European Parliament and said that the institution has to show the same courage that Daphne Caruana Galizia did. What might that mean in terms of an investigation, in terms of action that the European Union in some sense could take in Malta?
Well, I think it's very clear that the best way to honour the memory of Mrs. Galizia is to make sure that the investigation is carried out and that everything that has to be brought to light comes to light. Because clearly, I mean, everybody said this is a matter of freedom of the press. No, it's not. This is about fighting corruption, crime. It is about the rule of law, indeed. And I think it's also becoming very clear that this is not, it's not a Maltese matter. It's a European matter. Because if there's one weak link in the community of law that the European Union is, then the whole Union will not function. There have been concerns over corruption, money laundering, but also something like the golden visa scheme, which brings in people to the European Union that ultimately may acquire EU citizenship. And come on, they're not, old Russian grandmothers who've been saving every penny for the last 50 years in order to buy a golden visa into the European Union. We know what kind of money is coming in, and it is about time that not just of course, the Maltese authorities should do their job, but we should be watching very closely that it's done properly.
Well, Claude Moraes, if I bring you in, adding to this picture, we've had those recent revelations from the so-called Paradise Papers. We've had revelation after revelation after revelation. Now this murder of a journalist who was investigating corruption. Has the European Union been turning a blind eye, and is this perhaps the point where it all changes?
I agree with Sophie in 't Veld. It is a European matter. And I think one of the dangers is that we are overwhelmed by so many issues. The Paradise Papers and other issues will come up. And the key thing is to focus on what really matters. And I think in memory of the shocking situation that we've seen, I think the focus must be that there has to be some European investigation, but there has to be a cross-border dimension as well in terms of corruption.
Where does the European Union's jurisdiction extend to? How much can it step in?
Well, it's not just about jurisdiction. First of all, I have expressed, and I think we agree on this, grave concern about the decision of the European Commission to abolish their annual report on corruption in the member states, probably under pressure of the national governments. I think that was the wrong decision. Secondly, this House has called for a broader mechanism to monitor let's say, the health of the rule of law, fundamental rights and democracy in the European Union. And that would include, for example, fighting corruption, but also, for example, assessing the quality, the independence of the judiciary. And I think what happened in Malta is yet one more example, one more argument for such a mechanism. And I know that the Commission and the Member States have resisted that for a long time, but I really hope that everybody realizes this concerns us all. This concerns the Maltese people, but it also concerns the European Union. And we have to also make it very clear to those people who are responsible for the murder of Mrs. Galizia, that this is a community of law and we do not accept this. This is not just about the Maltese people, it's about all of us.
I mean, I do believe that there will have to be a Maltese discussion, an intense discussion on what happens in a sovereign country on such an important issue. Where a journalist is murdered in this way, and that must be done in detail. I agree with this, and that is for the Maltese. But the European dimension is critical, and I think Sophie in 't Veld puts her finger on something really important, which is that we predicted a long time ago, certainly in our committee, the Justice and Home Affairs Committee of the European Parliament, that no country is immune from corruption, and that if you allow this dam to burst, then you are not regarding any country which is a member of the EU to be part of a union of values. Now, there are mechanisms for this. If you don't stick to these mechanisms, you are going to see situations like this. The other issue, of course, is that journalism is not a national pursuit anymore. It is global, it is certainly European. And for this reason, you know, we have to have that European dimension is inevitable. It's not a question of whether it is referred to us, it's automatically in our hands.
Well, I would like to emphasize that we're talking about fundamental European values. And we're talking about values even now enshrined in the European Charter on Human Rights. We're talking about values enshrined in Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union. So I totally agree. This is not merely a Malta issue. This is an issue which is striking at the core of what we believe in as Europeans.
As was suggested earlier in this debate, when we have tried to have corruption reports and so on, I think the member states have not been supporting us. And one of the reasons for this is member states always want to watch their own back. So yes, the Parliament has been proactive, but it's not enough for the Commission to be proactive. Member states need to show their political power and support, you know, an investigation, but I don't think that is happening.
Well, I'm just wondering as well, we are seeing in certain parts of the European Union different tensions with the membership of the European Union itself. States are showing more nationalist tendencies, resisting perhaps a push for more federalism that we're seeing from the likes of Jean-Claude Juncker or Emmanuel Macron. Sophie in 't Veld, do you see this as a difficulty for the European Union to act as a bloc? It is now 28 member states, as we know, and we have these tensions there of some countries. Poland, for example, has been heavily criticised over degradation of the rule of law, for example, and is seen as pushing back against European efforts to take the action that you're all putting forward.
It's actually not countries, it's governments.
Excuse me, yes, member states' governments.
And the European Union, and I will always underline this, is not just a cooperation between 28 governments or 28 countries, it's also a union of over 500 million citizens, based on values laid down in Article 2. And that includes the rule of law. And it's becoming increasingly clear that as we have open borders, which is a good thing, because we also need to realize that we as European Union are also you know, it's us in the wider world. We need to have these open borders. But it cannot be that only criminals can benefit from open borders and that member states then say, oh, but law enforcement, you know, that's national sovereignty. And I would like to point at another risk, and that is in recent years, for example, in the fight against terrorism, but also the nationalist authoritarian tendencies that you describe, have restricted the powers of the media, for example, but also NGOs, ordinary citizens, to control, to check and hold to account governments. So that hampers the fight against corruption and crime. And I think we should be a lot more aware of those restrictions than we have been so far.
You mentioned Poland. I mean, you mentioned Poland, and for your viewers to understand why it is that the Parliament of the EU is involving itself in the affairs of a country, you have to really understand that we're not criticising governments because we just want to pinpoint a government. Just a change of election, a change of government isn't our issue. Our issue is when that change of government tries to change the constitution without a majority, even, you know, judges and so on. And, you know, that kind of situation is the thin end of the wedge.
All right, there are so many issues, unfortunately, that we could talk about that will spin out of this debate. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming in to talk about this with us here on France 24. And just before we leave you, seeing as we're talking about freedom of the press, fake news was named Word of the Year by the Collins Dictionary recently. So that brings us rather handily onto our fake news decoder here on Talking Europe. It's time for Fact or Fake. Take a look.
Is Europe on the brink of a separatist implosion? This is at least what the Russian television channel TV1 seems to believe, reporting about fears expressed in Europe following the referendum in Catalonia. TV1 even goes as far as suggesting that the European Union is on the brink of implosion, according to this map, presenting Europe as a collection of comforty states. Well, to a large extent, this is clearly an exaggeration. Brittany or the Alsace region, for instance, are currently miles away from parting ways with the rest of France. But the same cannot be said of other regions such as Flanders in Belgium, where the nationalists are cherishing hopes of a future as an independent country. The Nationalist Party in power, the NVA, is currently torn between its support for the Catalan separatists and its own participation in the Belgian federal government, which forces it to water down its separatist agenda. In Scotland, voters narrowly rejected independence in 2014, but the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, is now considering a second referendum following the Brexit vote in the UK. Another hotspot of separatism in Europe is northern Italy, where two regions have recently proclaimed their intention of holding a referendum on independence in the wake of the vote in Catalonia. But that's probably all when it comes to serious candidates for independence in Europe. For the rest, the map shown earlier is either ill-informed or deliberately misleading.
And that brings us to the end of our programme. Thanks very much for watching. I'd also like to thank our guests once again, Claude Moraes. Thank you for being with us, Sophie in 't Veld and Francis Zamit Dimech. Thank you all for your time. And that brings us to the end of part 1 of Talking Europe. We'll see you again in a couple of minutes for part 2.